Welcome to Security Weekly's Virtual Hacker Summer Camp 2020. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this segment is Richard Stiennon. He's Chief Research Analyst for IT Harvest, and he just produced a book called The Security Yearbook 2020. We're going to talk about the market, what's happening in the market, what's growing, what's not growing. Richard, welcome to Security Weekly.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here.
I was reminiscing slightly. I was trying to remember the first time we met, and it was when I was at Tenable. You were interviewing Ron Gula back in the day, and I took one of your books at the time. It was Up and to the Right or something like that, how to get on the Magic Quadrant and grow your business. But you've been doing a lot of research on the market trends and what's actually happening in the market. And I think what's interesting, one, you analyze like over 2,300 vendors, right? I mean, we've seen an expansion of security vendors explode over the last 5 to 8 years. I mean, I think when I was at Tenable, Paul and I were tracking like 300. Now we're, over 2,300. And so we want to dig into some of that research and kind of what did you find? And there's some market segments I want to dig into, but kind of give us an overview first of your research.
Yeah, sure. So, I started doing this research more than 10 years ago because I had been frustrated when I was at Gartner in that their old data quests, so it used to do, all the number gathering and crunching, like IDC still does. And they had fallen apart. They didn't have the numbers I needed to do the analysis. So when I started my own firm, I said, you know what, I'm going to do a bottoms-up analysis. So no more of this, the classic way to estimate a market size is look at all the public vendors, so you know their revenue, and assume that they're the big giants and they own 80% of the market. Boom, divide by 0.2 and you've got the entire market size. But in security, there are far, far more private companies than there are public companies. So why not look at every single company if you can find them? Which I've been doing for the last 10 years, trying to put them all together. And then last year, I finally published all those companies. And the one publicly available data I can get that is, not subject to the analysts or the vendors lying about their revenue or, in this case, their number of employees, is number of employees, because LinkedIn reports that. And so I just checked that every quarter. And now I got quarterly data. LinkedIn doesn't provide the insights, for a paid account for companies less than 50 people. And the vast majority of 2,336 companies have less than 50 people, right? They're startups or they're, getting along fine with the team of 7. So I can track all that quarter to quarter. And then if I look at the segments, I can track which segments are growing quarter to quarter. And I've only just got 2 quarters for this year. So I've got the first half, and I'm still pulling together what happened. It was a particularly interesting quarter to see who grew and who shrunk because COVID is impacting some vendors more than others. And some are just skyrocketing because they had something that could be deployed for at-home workers. And those companies, are doing extremely well. But some aren't. So I tracked the threat intelligence vendors as a separate segment 5 years ago. And back then they were growing at 87%. And that's because it was a new space. And there are only 23 vendors. Now there's 71 vendors. And on average, they're growing about 38%. So this first half of this year, the individual growth slowed down, but the market growth is, a lot bigger in absolute terms.
Yeah.
So it's, So I'm getting that bottoms up.
Yeah, great. Because, when we were at Tenable, we were doing some bottoms up analysis there as well. Because you would look at the IDC report, you mentioned it, and you look at the market shares report, and you're like, well, what's it growing at, right? And you used to hear device vulnerability management, for example, growing at 6 to 8% CAGRs. Well, we did a bottoms-up analysis. The market is actually bigger than that. It may not be, could be a little bigger, could have a little higher growth rates, but you use those IDC reports to kind of predict where the market's going to go. Now, I actually track the top 25 pure plays in what I call the Security Weekly 25 index. And every quarter, I go through their financials, revenue, earnings, kind of analyst ratings. And so I track that on a quarterly basis. And you're right, when COVID first came out, market tanked. And it was right around when I did my April report. And then I just did the July report a little while ago. And that market not only recovered, it was at all-time highs. You had my Security Weekly 25 index and the NASDAQ basically at all-time highs when I did that show a couple weeks ago. And so, to your point, COVID affected some, but it also benefited a number of vendors in the space.
Yeah, completely. And I've been trying to get, that's going to, as I rewrite the book for 2021, that's going to be the big story, right? There'll be a chapter devoted to the impact of COVID. And I'm getting input from CISOs everywhere. And, for sure, work from home is a thing now, and it's going to stay that way. And that, is going to open up opportunities for new vendors, right? That do so-called zero touch deployments of networking equipment. And I'm seeing a lot of that going on. It's very cool stuff.
Yeah, so what markets are thriving and which markets are flattening? I gave you the example of vuln management, right? Is that, if you think about traditional device-based vulnerability management, is that market still growing at a high CAGR? I know application security and application security vulnerabilities are, because we've seen just a tremendous growth in AppSec, and the number of sub-markets in AppSec, I think are there's 5 or 6 of them, right, and growing. Yeah. So is device-based vulnerability management slowing? And what other markets potentially are slowing based on your analysis?
Yeah, it's the device-based vulnerability management is something you have to do, right? No matter how onerous it is. And in some cases, doesn't actually improve your security if you just keep lists of vulnerable systems, right? So the adding on things to make it easier to patch those systems is growing even faster. But that said, Tenable is off, I think they're off 6% in the last 6 months in number of employees, while Qualys is up. Now, Tenable has a lot more employees. Qualys should have fewer employees because, they're supposedly cloud delivered. A SaaS-based offering should run a lot leaner than on-prem, and licensed software solution does. The real growth space is the IoT vulnerability people, right? So they're just taking everything we learned about servers and desktops and applying it to, smaller devices, many of which you can't run clients on. So you have to learn from what they're doing on the network, or, touch them somehow and figure out what version of firmware they have, and then compare the version of firmware to the known vulnerabilities to get it. That, could be a booming market because there are far more IoT devices than there are desktops and servers.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I assume the endpoint market's growing well. I mean, CrowdStrike's been doing well, and the endpoint vendors, I think, in this remote workforce environment and deploying endpoints to a bunch of new devices, that market's still growing, right?
Yeah, the market's growing, but it's got a couple of interesting, hiccups to it, right? First, Symantec kind of disappeared, right? Overnight, they stopped supporting their customers. So all of their customers are going to the other one. So, if you could measure Symantec's revenue, you'd see it plummeting dramatically. But you can't, because now they're part of Broadcom. But you will see the other guys who are picking up the dead weight that Symantec left growing dramatically, because that was billions of dollars of revenue. So that's pretty cool. The one thing I have trouble and frustration with is, we all know you should be doing some sort of app security, code scanning, etc. You rarely run into it being the thing that people are doing, right? It's always an uphill battle to get a dev team to invest in tools to improve their security, because they look at it as slowing down their operations. Why should they patch it? They're just going to update the whole, application next week anyways. Why should they slow the process down? So they just don't. And that's why we have so many vulnerabilities in apps. And it's, frustration to every single security person out there. It's like, why did you write that in the code? Or why did you not at least check for that in the code?
Yeah, application security is so interesting. Having spent some time in that space on the container security side, you've got static analysis, You have a software composition analysis looking at the binaries that are embedded. You've got container security, both on the static and runtime side. You have interactive, dynamic, runtime application self-protection. You got the WAF vendor. I mean, it's a huge market space with a lot of different types of solutions, all trying to solve an application security problem. So any vendors there that you see doing a really good job? I know a couple that I think would be doing well, like a Synopsys, even though they're also embedded under a larger umbrella. They have a pretty big AppSec portfolio.
Yeah, they do indeed, because they've done a few good acquisitions. But, I went to the BSIM conference that Synopsys holds in San Diego every year. And it moves around, but it was in San Diego. So, of course, I went. And it was great meeting these people who were, software assurance maturity people and just totally into it. But as I talked to them, I realized they would have teams of 6,000 developers at their banks, big banks, and giant teams developing software. And the software assurance team was 6 people. So if that's the case, they aren't doing software assurance everywhere, right? Because 6 people can't oversee 6,000 people and keep an eye on them. Right. So it's, it just isn't going to happen anytime soon. And I think of, the defense industrial base, probably has millions of developers working at Booz Allen and Lockheed and all the rest. And they're building systems that they think will never be touched by a hacker. So why worry about security? Yeah. And why add to the cost of developing code, which already costs $800 a line, I think, is what they quote for military systems now. So it'll always be an opportunity. And the ones that figure out how to, just fix it, that'd be great. Maybe that's where AI comes in. I've been pushing all my AI friends who keep trying to invent a better natural language processing solution. And I keep asking them, why are you spending all these billions of dollars to create something that will replace me, a writer, when you could be doing it to replace developers, right? Code is completely objective, right? It's well-defined, does just what it's supposed to do. You should be able to teach an AI, what, a particular SQL query looks like, and it will always be able to create that perfectly every time.
There, you just created a whole new market segment for AppSec. Yeah, that'll add like the 7th to the list. Yeah. What's going on with the firewall market? I mean, we're in an interesting transition period. We were already seeing the move from data centers into cloud services and extending the perimeter, and probably a little bit. I've tracked Fortinet and Palo Alto and Checkpoint, obviously in my 25 index. You've seen some slowdowns in revenue there. And then there's been some interesting acquisitions, at least by Palo Alto and Checkpoint, to augment some of that. But now that we're moving to a much more remote world, what's happening to that kind of firewall VPN space? Are the firewalls flattening and VPNs growing? What's happening there?
I think both are completely going away over time. So the writing's on the wall. There will be no enterprise that needs a hardware appliance in front of their corporate network. It might be 20 years from now, because whenever I say those things, I always leave out the fact that, there's still the Pentagon. They don't change ever. And every government agency doesn't change either. So there will be extremely late adapters coming on board 20 years from now. But as a market, selling hardware appliances to protect the data center and deploying smaller hardware appliances that do everything in one device, UTM or next-gen firewall, that's gone too. All you need is your router to be smart enough to route your traffic to a cloud proxy where all the filtering is done at massive scale. It's got to be built in the cloud. And that's where you see Zscaler, right? So you compare Zscaler's growth to all the other firewall vendors, and you can just see the difference. The one thing I'm looking for is evidence that Zscaler is hurting the sales of Palo Alto and Fortinet, and I don't see that evidence yet. So sometime, maybe the next 3 quarters, all of a sudden they'll start to struggle because they haven't built something that would destroy their own market. And you can't go to Palo Alto and say, hey, I need cloud security, and And they say, oh, great, just buy a license, same thing you'd pay for a $100,000 box, but we'll sell it to you a little cheaper, and you'll run it on a VM in the cloud and then configure it, et cetera. That is not what the so-called zero trust cloud access is. That replaces VPNs. You don't need to go to the corporate network anymore because all of your apps will be in the cloud anyways. So now you just need to go over the internet to whatever apps you need. And that gave rise to another market that's just skyrocketing because there's so many vendors in it. And they call themselves zero trust as well. But it's really, application access control, right? It's the old single sign-on sitting in the cloud. You want to get to a certain application, they authenticate against Active Directory, get a SAML assertion that you've got such and such authorizations. You get to the app. The app doesn't even appear on the internet anywhere. So a showdown isn't going to find it, can't scan for it. You don't know where it is unless you're a customer or an end user with credentials to get in. And luckily that's not the end. If that were all that we had to worry about, that would be the end of the 2,300 vendors that weren't doing that. But of course, we always have the threat actors getting the credentials. They will get on the endpoint and have the same access that the end user does. So you still have to do a lot of network monitoring and kind of dynamic control over that access and control where they are and what time of day that they're logging in and what they're actually doing within the app.
Yeah, I think the biggest enhancement to zero trust is moving away from the network aspects of zero trust, because that's what it was early on, right? It was a network microsegmentation kind of thing from zero trust. But now when you bring in the application and the identity and user combinations, now you get to a much better concept of zero trust. And that's why I've been a big proponent of app user and data security controls, because if I can control that triad well, those are the types of controls that transcend any transformation that's going on in the industry.
Yeah, completely agree. Though I do want to point out, at least in my mind, the first time I ever heard the term zero trust, it was the data side of it, right? I'm going to upload stuff to Dropbox, but I'm trusting Dropbox not to read my data. And just like you have DMs on Twitter and you trust Twitter not to read your DMs. So sure enough, you need a zero trust model. You need to encrypt everything and maintain keys for yourself, which there's some interesting things going on. And, key management is, one of the best things you can invest in my mind. But key management is difficult to do and usually needs a hardware security module to generate the keys with two people accessing at once with physical cards, etc. But a new trend I'm seeing is virtual hardware security modules. And they can sit in the cloud, and they use the secure enclaves in Intel chips in order to generate and store those keys. So there's that layered on to some of the data encryption issues that we have is going to make it a lot easier to secure your data going forward.
Yeah, the last market segment I want to talk about just briefly is cloud security. And where are you seeing it? We've got an interesting dynamic with cloud security because you've got somebody like Amazon building a lot of capabilities natively into AWS services. But then you also have this proliferation of cloud security vendors. What's happening in the cloud security space?
Yeah, great question. I just posted an article to Forbes talking about all this, and it basically relates, so here I am pulling together a directory, and most of 2018 and early 2019, whenever I ran across a vendor that had clouds on their website, I said, oh, cloud security, put them in that category. And I'm going to have a category of cloud security vendors. But then when I went back to rationalize my categories, I realized that, hey, these guys say they're cloud security, but they're really network security for cloud instances, right? Between VPCs or whatever, they're tracking your network security or they're doing DLP over the networks. And then some other ones were doing, container and VM security. That's endpoint security. That's because I made the decision a long time ago that server security was the same as endpoint security or belonged in that big bucket. And then all the identity solutions that are offered in the cloud only, so Ping and Okta and the rest, they're identity and access management. So by the time I was done, I didn't have a single cloud vendor. So title of my post this morning was, there is no cloud security market segment. And of course, there's plenty of cloud security and plenty of things you have to secure in the cloud. And there are hundreds and hundreds of vendors that help you do that. But they're just taking the model that we had in the data center, moving it to the cloud, which makes total sense, right? The only thing new in the cloud is getting down to containers and serverless. And we're just going to apply the same kinds of controls to those that we had for servers.
If we can. There are a few nuances, having spent time in that
serverless
space.
Is a little hard, but yeah.
Even containers to an extent, right? I mean, some of the approaches that were attempted didn't really pan out, privileged containers and some other crazy stuff that happened. Even kernel modules that you would do at an endpoint don't necessarily have the same portability when you move to serverless. So you move into a Fargate environment where you don't have any access to the underlying operating system or infrastructure. I mean, you got to think differently about some of those environments. And so, there has been some interesting innovation out there, but not everything from the data center is going to apply into the cloud.
Yeah, the one I'm looking at is the ability to just refresh the container or the VM, every minute. And then even if it has a 0-day vulnerability, the attacker would have to, accomplish whatever they're after in 60 seconds, or else it's been refreshed with the mirrored version of it without the exploit active in it, and they got to start over every time. So they'd have to program something that moves really, really fast.
Yes, the promise of DevOps and Agile and deploying code, multiple times a day. Every minute is a little rough. I think Etsy's the fastest I've seen, and they push code about every 7 minutes. I haven't seen anybody go faster than that yet, but yeah, it would be interesting.
I've seen this one do a complete update of a DNS server every 60 seconds, and they can go faster. It's just, why pay for all the extra containers you need to host the mirrored one that's clean and keep pushing it back. A lot of effort.
Interesting. Great conversation, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us on Security Weekly.
It was fun. Glad to be here.
If anybody wants to get Richard's industry insights, you can go to it-harvest.com. You go /shop. You can get the new Security Yearbook 2020. And with that, we'll take a quick break and then come back with more interviews on Virtual Hacker Summer Camp.